Good Shabbos. This week's portion is Parshas Mishpatim, and at this point the Torah transitions from telling us stories, whether it was the stories of the forefathers in the book of Bereshis, or the stories of the Jewish people in Egypt and their exodus from Egypt in the book of Shemos. And here we start with Mishpatim, the laws, and many, many different laws. I'd like to focus on two different psukim, two different sentences, verses in this week's portion. One of them is about shochad, about taking bribery. And this is v'shochad lo sikach, you should not take bribery, ki yashochad ya'aver pikim, because bribery blinds those that see, v'salev divrei tzadikim, and it corrupts the words that are just. And I'm there following the translation of the Art Scroll, which is based on Rashi. And Rashi says here, "V'shochad lo sikach," you shouldn't take bribery, afilu lishbot emes, even to make a truthful judgment. Then he goes on to say that if it blinds the those that see, it says afilu chacham b'Torah, even someone who's wise, who's a sage, who knows Torah, they're afraid that you will forget your learning as a result of taking a bribe. Rashi's being a little bit protective of those that he views as righteous and scholars and sages and judges, and saying that when you take the bribe, you'll actually forget what you know rather than actually specifically lying. And he's saying that because there was a verse before which says, Midvar sheker tirchak, you should distance yourself from lies. So we already know you shouldn't lie. So he's saying now, it's even if you're not lying, you might be forgetting your Torah. But another way of understanding this, and perhaps it's just another nuanced view of what Rashi's saying, is that not that you'll forget your Torah, but you'll corrupt your Torah. You won't forget what you learned, but you'll distort it. And here we see already the idea of confirmation bias. When you have a view of someone, a positive view of someone, now that might be because they gave you a bribe, they gave you money, and you're dependent on them. Or it could be because you see them as righteous people, or they're your friend, or your family, or you have a ideology which fits with the story that they're telling you. All of those things create a bias towards seeing something in a distorted view. Again, not that you're lying, but rather that it's a distortion of the truth, or a certain perception. You only look at a certain part of the story. And for example, one of the laws that we're told about judges in halacha, in Jewish law, is that a judge should not sit with one party first. And it's obvious, because as soon as you hear the story, or the side of the story, of one of the parties of a dispute, you're automatically going to be drawn to them, and you're thinking in their terms. Then, when you hear the other side, all of a sudden that other side becomes in opposition to something that you already know. It goes against what you already have in your mind as the truth. And therefore, there's a bias towards understanding it from their perspective. And in a way, sometimes you could argue that it's better for someone, for their character development, to actually have an outright lie than have this confirmation bias. Because when you outwardly lie, at least in your mind, you know that that's a lie. You could make a distinction between truth and falsehood, and for whatever reason at this point you're lying, and hopefully at a certain point later in time you'll be able to come back to the truth because you know that's the truth. Now, of course, when you habituate yourself to lying, it also starts to undermine how you see truth and falsehood. But at least there's some kind of recognition of what the truth is. But most of what we do, or honest people do, or people who think they're honest do, is that they try to look at things objectively, but their distorted view comes as a result of a certain bias that they have or prejudice that they have. And we're all guilty of that. Just this morning, I was looking at a article on the CNN, and just like many articles in many newspapers, the title was that Israel was closing off parts of the West Bank because of bombings of buses. And in the article, it talked about how the buses that were bombed didn't harm anybody. Nobody was hurt. So when you read the article, immediately the first thing you see is that Israel closed off the West Bank. Therefore, Israel is, in a sense, somewhat of a guilty party. And what was it for? It was in response to bombings that didn't harm anybody. What it didn't say was that these bombs were meant to kill many people, but they made the timers incorrectly. They set the timers wrong. And therefore, luckily for us, and because Israel, there were people who were careful and they were able to find all the other bombs that were planted, people weren't killed. And it should have said, as a result of an attempt of bombing of buses trying to kill many people, Israel closes off the West Bank. That would change your view and perspective. And this is true throughout the media for the last decades when we talk about what's happening in Israel. There's a bias. And I think we have to realize that we all have that bias. We also sometimes close ourselves off to seeing things which are done, whether it's by Israel, by fellow Jews, or by our family, or by friends, our neighbors, because we feel close to them. And we also have a view of them that they're good people. So sometimes when somebody is seeing someone as someone good or someone that they should have pity on, they have a hard time understanding that they also could be doing something which is really inherently evil. And I think this is the bias that exists even today in regard to the Palestinians. I think there's many people who really deep down want to do good, want to help those that are downtrodden, those that are aggrieved, those that are suffering. And it's hard for them to be able to be intellectually honest and keep a frame of reference that says, hey, let's look at this very objectively and see what was done and why it was done and try to honestly judge the situation. And it's very difficult. Once you've taken shochad, once you've taken bribery, and that bribery could be an extra thank you, a little favor in the street, someone looks at you kindly, it's almost impossible on every single level to remove that bribery. But 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 we have to try. That's what we have to attempt. I'll just say, give an example of what I think is the same idea in regard to even Jewish thinkers. There's a rabbi, Rabbi Chanan Wasserman, who says the fact that as somebody, a boy or girl who's bar bat mitzvah, is obligated in all the commandments, and one of the commandments is to believe in God. So he says, how is it possible do we expect a 12 or 13-year-old child to have a belief in God? You need to have deep philosophical thoughts before you come to the conclusion that there is or there is not a God. So he answers that, you know what, really, it's very simple. It's clear that there's a God. You don't have to be smart. You don't have to be a philosopher. It's obvious to all that have their eyes open that there's a God and what your belief system should be. But because we're all have shocha, we all have bribery, we have desires, we have reasons why our thoughts are corrupted, we don't see the truth, which is very obvious to those that are purely innocent and willing to see the truth and without any distortion. And I would make the argument maybe a little differently, that this rabbi who's making this suggestion, he also has a bias. He has a bias towards that there should be what we call emunah pshuta, simple faith, and he has a hard time accepting philosophical thought, because a lot of times philosophical thought comes to contradict religious belief, and therefore his bias is to say that it's obvious the arguments for God and belief in the Torah, but perhaps they're more difficult to come to. Perhaps that really it is something hard, and you need philosophical insight in order to come to these determinations. And perhaps you could argue that a 12 or 13-year-old is not expected to have the perfect faith right away, but he's obligated, or she is obligated, to start down that path. But his bias was that It should be simple. We shouldn't have any philosophical debates, because philosophical debates are by its nature very dangerous, that you might come to the wrong conclusion. So here's an example where there's no question that he is trying to search for the truth, and he's trying to defend the Torah. But there's also a confirmation bias there, which you could say is legitimate, or you could look at it from a different angle. And this is the problem that we have when we deal with these types of issues. Intellectual honesty is very, very difficult to attain, because we all have our own prejudices. We all have our biases, and that which we've thought for decades, or even just a few minutes. But once we have a certain perspective in our head, it's very hard to clear our mind of that. But that, I think, is what we are obligated to do, to try to judge every situation with as much honesty as possible. Midvar sheker tirchak. We should really distance ourselves from falsehood as much as possible. And therefore, when I would read this verse, V'salav divrei tzadikim, not necessarily just to corrupt the words that are just, but it even corrupts those that are just, those that are tzaddikim, or righteous people, who are good people, who care about people. But they're also afflicted with shochad. They're also afflicted with bribery. And anybody could be tainted with this accusation of bribery. And it's very hard to determine when somebody is being truthful, when somebody is able to remove all their biases and all their prejudices, or not. But that is our obligation in life, in relationship to whether we're judging Israel, whether we're judging our family, whether we're judging our fellow, our neighbor, the fellow who sits next to us in shul. It doesn't matter. We have to try to approach this with as much openness to the truth as possible. Good Shabbos.